The empire of the Tsars had fallen. The red flags were raised over Moscow, and the old world was burning. Russia was drowning in chaos, civil war, famine, betrayal, cities turned into battlefields, brothers into enemies. And in the heart of that fire, a man named Joseph Jugashvili, known to his comrades as Stalin, began to rise. He was not the most brilliant of Lenin's followers, nor the most charismatic, but he had something the others didn't: silence. The kind of silence that hides calculation. When others spoke of revolution and ideals, Stalin watched, learned, and waited. He was a man who understood power not as a dream, but as survival. In 1918, the Russian Civil War reached its boiling point. The Red Army fought the Whites, loyal to the fallen Tsar, in a brutal war of extinction. And one city stood as the key to southern Russia, Tsaritsyn on the banks of the Volga River. Whoever controlled it controlled the gateway to the Caucasus, to oil, to victory. Lenin sent one of his trusted men to take command there, a Georgian with cold eyes and a steel heart, Commissar Stalin. When Stalin arrived in Tsaritsyn, the city was already collapsing. The Whites surrounded it, the population starved, and chaos reigned. His first order wasn't strategy, it was fear. He executed anyone who questioned his authority, accused officers of treason without trial, and replaced experienced generals with loyal but unskilled followers. He turned Tsaritsyn into a fortress and a grave. But something strange happened. Against all logic, against the famine and the blood, the city held. The Red Army survived, the Whites retreated, and the legend began. Moscow declared Stalin the hero of Tsaritsyn, the man who saved the revolution. Newspapers called him the Lion of the Volga. No one mentioned the thousands he executed. No one spoke of how many starved under his command. Victory forgave everything, and Stalin believed it. Tsaritsyn was his first empire, his first kingdom built on death and loyalty. He learned the taste of absolute control, and he liked it. Later, when he would rename that same city Stalingrad, he wasn't honoring the battle. He was honoring himself. The myth of Stalin was born in Tsaritsyn long before the world would know his name. In the years that followed, the Bolsheviks won the war. The Tsar and his family were gone. Lenin ruled from Moscow, frail but triumphant. And Stalin waited, always in the shadows, always watching. He became the master of organization, the man who controlled food, railways, and records. Every list passed through his hands. Every life could be erased with his signature. The others, Trotsky, Bukharin, Zinoviev, underestimated him. They thought he was slow, provincial, dull. They didn't see the storm behind his silence. When Lenin died in 1924, the struggle for power began. The revolution had devoured its fathers before, and it would again. Stalin played his part perfectly. Humble, loyal, unassuming. He wept at Lenin's funeral and called himself a disciple of the great teacher. But behind the curtain, he forged alliances, spread rumors, and isolated his enemies one by one. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. Trotsky was exiled, then hunted. The old Bolsheviks were executed in show trials. And Stalin, the quiet man from Georgia, became the new Tsar. The myth of Tsaritsyn became prophecy. He told himself that he alone had the strength to save Russia. He alone could hold the nation together. The city that once bled under his rule would one day bear his name. It was destiny, but destiny, like history, is cruel. In the late 1930s, paranoia consumed him. Millions were arrested, executed, or sent to the frozen gulags. The very men who had fought beside him in Tsaritsyn were now declared traitors. Stalin built an empire of fear, and yet the people still called him father. His propaganda turned him into a god. Children prayed to his portraits. Poets compared him to the sun. The man who had drowned a city in blood now ruled an empire in silence. And then, in 1941, the silence broke. From the west came the sound of thunder, the roar of engines, the march of boots, the scream of sirens. The German war machine had crossed the border. Hitler had betrayed the pact. The invasion of the Soviet Union had begun. Stalin refused to believe it. Reports piled on his desk, maps bled with red arrows, and yet he sat motionless. For days, he said nothing. His generals begged him for orders. None came. He had trusted no one for so long that when the truth finally arrived, he trusted no one to face it with him. The myth of the savior of Tsaritsyn was about to be tested, not in whispers, but in fire. Summer 1941. Europe was already burning. Hitler's armies ruled from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow's allies. France had fallen, Britain was bleeding, and the Nazi flag fluttered over half the continent. And somewhere deep inside the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin still believed the devil would honor a pact. He had signed it himself, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, a promise that Germany and the Soviet Union would never attack each other. But Hitler had no intention of keeping promises. He wanted more than power. He wanted a continent. At dawn on June 22, 1941, the silence of the Eastern Front shattered under the roar of 3.3 million German soldiers. It was the largest invasion in human history, Operation Barbarossa. 3 arrows slashed across the map of Russia, north to Leningrad, center to Moscow, south to Kiev and the Volga. Hitler's generals believed the campaign would end in 6 weeks. "Kick in the door," Hitler said, "and the whole rotten structure will collapse." He was wrong, but at that moment, the Red Army was collapsing for real. Stalin had ignored every warning. British intelligence, his own spies, even defectors told him that the Germans were preparing to invade. He dismissed them all. No one as rational as Hitler would invade the Soviet Union, he said. But Hitler wasn't rational. He was obsessed. He saw the East as his Lebensraum, the living space for his future empire. He wanted Ukraine's grain, the Caucasus oil, and the minerals of the Urals. It was an economic crusade dressed as a holy war. The first weeks were a catastrophe. Entire Soviet divisions vanished. Millions of soldiers were captured. Cities fell overnight, and Nazi tanks rolled across fields like a metal storm. But the Soviets weren't just outgunned. They were decapitated. Stalin's own paranoia had slaughtered his commanders. During the Great Terror of the 1930s, he had executed 80% of his generals. The army was blind, leaderless, and terrified. The very purge that secured his power now threatened his country. Still, the Nazis had underestimated one enemy that never sleeps. Distance. From Poland to Moscow was over 1,000 kilometers of mud, forest, and endless fields. Each mile drained fuel, men, and machines. By autumn, the German supply lines were stretched to their breaking point. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, began to dim. And then came the Russian winter. It fell like a curse. Engines froze, guns jammed, men died in their sleep. The temperature plunged to -30. German boots split and tank tracks cracked like glass. The Nazis had planned for a summer victory, not a Siberian nightmare. And suddenly, the invincible army was stuck in a land that refused to die. Stalin was no hero in those months. When the invasion began, he disappeared for days, paralyzed by shock. But when he returned as the tyrant of necessity. He ordered factories to be torn apart and moved beyond the Urals, whole industries loaded on trains and rebuilt under the snow. He ordered his generals to stand their ground, and if they failed, they were shot. He gave the order that would echo through history, not one step back. It was not patriotism. It was terror turned into discipline. But it worked. The Soviets fought like a cornered animal. The Battle of Moscow stopped the German advance, barely. Then came the counterattack, the snow-covered soldiers of Siberia pushing the Nazis back for the first time. Hitler was furious. He had wanted a swift decapitation. Instead, he had awakened a monster. By spring 1942, Germany had a choice: retreat or redirect. Hitler chose to redirect, toward the south, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, toward the Volga River. There lay the industrial artery of the Soviet Union, and on its banks, a city with a name that sounded like an invitation to war. Advisors told him he could cut the Volga anywhere. He didn't need the city, but ego is a disease shared by dictators. Hitler wanted to crush the city that carried his enemy's name. He wanted Stalin himself to watch it burn. And Stalin, hearing the same reports, felt the same rage. He issued his infamous Order 227, the Order of Blood, not a step back. It was not just a military command. It was a vow to defend his own myth. From that moment, Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a stage set for a cosmic duel between two egos too large to share a continent. Both men believed the world was watching their destiny unfold. For Hitler, it was revenge for Napoleon's failure, the final proof of German invincibility. For Stalin, it was Tsaritsyn reborn, the chance to rewrite his legend with real blood. When the first German bombs fell on Stalingrad in August 1942, the city vanished in fire. Hundreds of tons of explosives turned wooden houses into ash, killing 40,000 civilians in 3 days. The Volga burned. But Stalin's response was simple: hold. He sent reinforcements across the river in open boats under artillery fire. They called it the meat grinder. Yet they went. Because in Stalin's Russia, disobedience was a death sentence too. In Berlin, Hitler celebrated. His armies had reached the edge of the Volga. He promised his people that within weeks, the Soviet Union would be on its knees. But beneath the ashes of the city, a different battle was awakening. A war that would swallow millions and change the century forever. The river was the same as in 1918, but the stakes were infinite. Stalin's old myth was about to face reality, and this time it would not be a story of propaganda. It would be a story of hell. August 23, 1942. The sky over Stalingrad turned black. The German Luftwaffe had arrived, and with it came the sound of apocalypse. 600 bombers filled the heavens, releasing thousands of tons of fire. Wooden houses burst like matchsticks. Streets melted into rivers of flame. The air itself burned. By the time the bombers vanished into the clouds, 40,000 people were dead. Not soldiers, but mothers, children, workers, the souls of the city. Stalingrad was gone. Yet, somehow, it had only just begun. In the smoldering ruins, Soviet soldiers crawled out from under the rubble. They found rifles buried under bricks, ammunition soaked in ash, and bodies they didn't have time to mourn. Across the river, Stalin listened in silence. His city, the city that bore his name, was under siege. But surrender was impossible. He had already declared it. Not one step back. Stalingrad was not to be defended. It was to be sacrificed. The Germans entered the outskirts, expecting another quick victory. They found instead a nightmare. Every building had become a fortress. Every street a killing ground. Soviet snipers hid in basements and factories. Machine guns rattled from shattered windows. The Nazis called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. They would take a building by day, lose it by night, and take it again at dawn. Among the chaos rose a man named Vasily Chukov, commander of the 62nd Army. He was no elegant general. His men called him General Stubbornness. He moved his headquarters right to the front line, sleeping among his soldiers, sharing their bread, their fear, their determination. When his staff suggested retreat, he laughed. "We will fight where we stand," he said. "We will die, but we will not move." Chukov understood something the Germans didn't. The city itself was his weapon. The bombings that had destroyed it had also turned it into a maze, where tanks could not move, planes could not aim, and soldiers had to fight face to face. He ordered his troops to stay as close to the enemy as possible, so close that the Germans couldn't call in airstrikes without killing their own men. The soldiers called this the hugging tactic. Every meter of ground cost blood. The Red October factory, the Barricade factory, the tractor plant, they became names, whispered like prayers. Men fought for staircases, for single rooms, for windows overlooking the river. The front lines shifted every hour. Sometimes, soldiers fought with knives, shovels, even bricks. In the middle of it all, loudspeakers blared Soviet propaganda every 7 minutes. A German soldier dies in Stalingrad. The sound echoed through ruins filled with smoke and ghosts. Women fought too. 1 million Soviet women served in the war, and hundreds were in Stalingrad, as medics, artillery gunners, and snipers. Some became legends. The Germans called them the wives of the rifle. For the Nazis, women belonged in homes, not on battlefields. But here, the women of Stalingrad proved otherwise. They fought beside men, and they died beside them. As autumn deepened, the Germans pushed harder. They took 90% of the city. From the high ground of Mamayev Kurgan, Their artillery rained death across the Volga. Soviet troops clung to a few kilometers of land along the riverbank, trapped between water and enemy. Supplies were scarce, reinforcements dying before even crossing the river. The Volga had become a grave, yet still they held on. Hitler announced to the world that Stalingrad had fallen. In Berlin, there were parades and speeches. In reality, the Soviets were still fighting in the shadows, refusing to die. The Germans didn't understand what they were facing anymore. This was no ordinary army, it was a people possessed. Stalin's cruelty had turned into steel. For every soldier killed, another rose from the smoke. For every street lost, another was reclaimed by night. Letters found later on dead German soldiers told the truth. Stalingrad one wrote, "is the grave of the Wehrmacht." Another wrote, "they are not human, these Russians. They fight like beasts who have forgotten fear, but even beasts bleed." The Soviets were paying an unbearable price. Thousands died every day. Chukov knew his men were breaking. Winter was approaching again, and with it, their only chance. The Germans were exhausted, starving, freezing, and still. Hitler refused to let them rest. "Hold your ground," he ordered. "Victory is close." But the only thing close was doom. For Stalin, Stalingrad had become more than strategy. It was his pride, his legend reborn. He couldn't lose it, because if Stalingrad fell, so would he. His ego had built the city's name. Now the city's survival had to protect it. He saw in the burning streets not ruin, but destiny, the same destiny that began back in Tsaritsyn. He had survived chaos once. Now he believed he could survive it again. As snow began to fall, both sides were ghosts. The German Sixth Army was trapped inside a grave of its own making, while the Soviets bled to keep a city that no longer existed. The world watched, uncertain which would collapse first, the Nazi machine or the Soviet will. And then, in November, under a frozen sky, the balance began to shift. Somewhere beyond the city, new forces were gathering. Stalin's best generals had been waiting, silent, patient, planning something enormous. They called it Operation Uranus, a strike not at the front, but at the sides. A trap. In the next chapter of this story, the hunters would become the hunted. The encirclement would begin. The legend of Stalingrad, the one Hitler mocked and Stalin worshipped, was about to be written in full. The fire had not died. It was only changing direction. By late November 1942, the map of Stalingrad looked like a wound that refused to heal. The German Sixth Army, once the pride of Hitler's military machine, was buried deep in the ruins. Cold, hungry, and surrounded by death, they still believed salvation would come from the Führer S-words. But Stalin and his generals were done waiting. After months of bleeding in silence, they were ready to strike back. The operation had a name that sounded like thunder: Operation Uranus. Behind the frozen lines, in secret, two Soviet masterminds, Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, were planning the impossible. They didn't want to fight the Germans head-on. They wanted to trap them. For weeks, they studied every weak point, every road, every overconfident division that guarded the German flanks. Those flanks weren't held by the elite Wehrmacht. They were guarded by tired, poorly supplied armies from Italy, Romania, and Hungary. Stalin had been patient, and now the patience was paying off. To make the plan work, the Soviets relied on deception, maskirovka, the art of camouflage and misdirection. Entire divisions moved at night under silence, headlights covered, engines wrapped in cloth. Fake radio transmissions were sent miles away to confuse the Germans. Even the snow was used as a weapon, hiding tanks under white sheets. Hitler's generals noticed strange movements, but he dismissed them. "The Russians are finished," he said. "They have no strength left." It was arrogance dressed as confidence, the kind that precedes disaster. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the sky cracked open. The Soviet artillery roared across the Volga in a storm that lasted for hours. The earth trembled as thousands of guns fired at once. Then came the tanks, rolling like iron beasts through the snow, smashing into the Romanian lines north of the city. Within hours, the defense collapsed. Soldiers fled in panic, and the Red Army poured through the gap. A day later, the southern flank was hit, and by November 23rd, both Soviet forces met near the town of Kaluk. The jaws of the trap closed. The German Sixth Army was encircled to 300,000 men cut off from the rest of the world. The hunters had become the hunted. For the first time since the beginning of the war, Hitler's invincible army was surrounded, frozen in a steel ring of fire and ice. In his headquarters, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus couldn't believe it. He had warned Berlin about the weakness of their flanks. Now it was too late. He sent urgent messages to Hitler. "We are surrounded. Request permission to retreat." The answer came cold and clear. "Hold your position. Stalingrad must not fall." Hitler's ego couldn't allow retreat. He couldn't admit defeat in a city named after his greatest enemy. He promised Paulus that supplies would come by air. The Luftwaffe would feed the army from the skies. It sounded heroic until reality arrived. The Sixth Army needed 800 tons of food and ammunition every day. The Luftwaffe could barely deliver 1/10 of that. Snowstorms blinded the pilots. Soviet anti-aircraft fire filled the skies, and planes crashed before they could even drop their loads. Inside the city, men starved. Horses were slaughtered for food. Some ate glue and leather. The cold was merciless. The temperature dropped to -40. Weapons froze, engines stopped, fingers blackened. Soldiers slept in holes dug into the snow, wrapped in torn blankets, listening to the howling of Soviet artillery. Disease spread faster than bullets: frostbite, typhus, dysentery. The Germans, once masters of blitzkrieg, were now prisoners of their own arrogance. Meanwhile, Stalin's propaganda machine roared to life. Soviet radios broadcasted victory speeches, music, and messages to the German soldiers. "Stalingrad will be your grave." Leaflets fell from the sky showing starving German prisoners who had already surrendered. Some soldiers cried, others laughed bitterly. They knew the truth. Their world had shrunk to a few frozen streets. In December, Hitler sent Field Marshal Manstein with a rescue force Operation Winter Storm. He got within 50 kilometers of the trapped army. Paulus begged to be allowed to break out and meet them halfway. "No," came the order again. "The Sixth Army will stand firm." It was the command of a man fighting for his pride, not his people. By January, starvation became the real enemy. Soldiers boiled snow for water. Dead bodies were stacked to block the wind. Ammunition ran out. A German officer wrote in his diary, "The wounded beg for bullets. We have none left to give." Inside his bunker, Paulus sat motionless, staring at maps that no longer mattered. On January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted him to field marshal, a cruel gesture. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The message was clear: kill yourself before you fail me. But Paulus didn't. He was too broken, too exhausted, too human. 2 days later, on January 31st, Soviet troops stormed his headquarters. The once mighty general stood up slowly, pale and shaking. He handed over his pistol. Stalingrad was over. The Reich's greatest army had fallen. Of the 300,000 who were trapped, only 91,000 survived to be taken prisoner. Most would never return home. They would die in Soviet camps, buried under snow and silence. The Volga ran red that winter, with the blood of both armies, with the price of pride. For Stalin, it was more than victory. It was resurrection. The man who once believed he saved Tsaritsyn had now truly saved Stalingrad. The myth was reborn, not in propaganda, but in reality. He had defeated Hitler in a battle the world thought unwinnable. His legend, carved in fear and fire, was complete. But legends, once born, demand sacrifices. The Soviet Union paid for this victory with over 1 million lives. The streets were filled with corpses, frozen mid-step. The ruins of Stalingrad looked less like triumph and more like the end of the world. Yet for Stalin, this devastation was beauty proof that history itself had chosen him again. The world watched in awe. The Nazi war machine had been stopped. The myth of invincibility was broken. And the man who once ruled through terror now ruled through victory. Stalingrad had turned him from a tyrant into a god. But gods built from war are never satisfied. The smoke had barely cleared over Stalingrad when the world realized that something had changed forever. What began as a German march of conquest had ended as a funeral procession in the snow. For the first time since the war began, the myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered, and in its place, a new myth was born. The myth of Joseph Stalin, the man who had faced Hitler and lived. Across the Soviet Union, bells rang. In Moscow, fireworks lit up the frozen sky. Stalin's portrait appeared in every newspaper, every home, every classroom. The headlines called him the savior of the motherland. The propaganda machine he had once built to control the people was now feeding on real victory. His paranoia, his brutality, his purges, all of it was rewritten as sacrifice. Comrade Stalin foresaw everything, the posters said. He led us to triumph, but behind the triumph was a graveyard. Over 1 million Soviets, soldiers and civilians, had died in Stalingrad alone. The city was gone. Streets had no names anymore. Buildings were just skeletons of brick and ash. The Volga River, once a symbol of life, was clogged with wreckage and bodies. And yet, Stalin ordered that the city must stand again. "We will rebuild," he said, "not because we must, but because it proves that we cannot be destroyed." His architects called it the resurrection of stone. The survivors, broken and hollow-eyed, worked among the ruins, clearing debris with frozen hands. Every brick they lifted was another line in the legend. Stalingrad was no longer just a battlefield. It had become the heart of Soviet identity. To lose everything and still rise, that was the message. That was Stalin's legacy. Meanwhile, in Germany, the news was kept secret for days. Hitler refused to believe Paulus had surrendered. He locked himself away, shouting at maps that no longer meant anything. For the first time, even his generals saw the truth. The Führer was not infallible. He had gambled his empire for pride and lost. The German people would learn of the defeat slowly, through whispers and rumors. But by then, the damage was done. The tide of the war had turned. In London, Churchill called Stalingrad the hinge of fate. In Washington, Roosevelt compared it to Thermopylae, a battle where men had stood against impossible odds. And for the Soviet people, it became something deeper, a miracle carved out of madness. Mothers told their children that the defenders of Stalingrad had saved the world, and in the Kremlin, Stalin smiled. He knew that power wasn't just built on fear, it was built on myth. He had survived the revolution, the purges, the famine, and now the war. Every disaster that should have destroyed him only made him stronger. His propaganda ministers filled the airwaves with his voice. Statues rose. Poems were written. School children memorized his words. Comrade Stalin, the father of nations, the genius of humanity. But those who worked close to him knew better. Victory had not softened him, it had hardened him. His suspicions deepened. Generals who had led the Red Army to victory were suddenly dangerous. Zhukov, the hero of Moscow and Berlin, was exiled to command a remote region. Stalin couldn't share glory, not even with those who earned it for him. The shadow of Tsaritsyn, the city where his paranoia was born, still haunted him. He trusted no one. Still, the world could not deny what had happened. The Soviet Union, thought to be on its knees in 1941, was now the rising power of the world. Factories roared back to life, producing tanks, planes, and dreams of empire. Stalin called it the Great Patriotic War, a phrase that erased ideology and replaced it with faith. Communism wasn't the god anymore. Stalin was. By 1945, the Red Army was rolling across Europe, pushing the Germans back mile by mile. The ruins of Stalingrad had become a symbol carried by every soldier. They didn't just fight for revenge. They fought for redemption. When Soviet soldiers finally entered Berlin, they wrote messages on the Reichstag walls. For Stalingrad, it was not just vengeance, it was prophecy fulfilled. After the war, Stalin stood as the unchallenged ruler of half the world. In the West, they feared him. In the East, they worshipped him. The Iron Curtain fell, and behind it stood the man who had turned suffering into power. The hero of Stalingrad, the architect of survival, the father of a nation that would outlive him, or so he believed. But legends are fragile things. The same myth that raised him would also consume him. The paranoia that built his empire never left his eyes. Every victory was followed by a purge. Every celebration by silence. He rebuilt Stalingrad, not as a city of the people, but as a monument to himself. Its avenues were lined with statues of soldiers holding rifles, their faces carved with defiance. At the center stood a massive memorial, towering over the Volga the motherland calls. It was a woman, sword raised to the sky, mouth open in eternal cry. She wasn't Stalin, and she wasn't the party. She was Russia itself, the suffering mother who had buried her children and still stood tall. Ironically, she became the true symbol of Stalingrad, not the man who claimed to have saved it. History, in its quiet way, had corrected him. In his final years, Stalin rarely spoke of Stalingrad. To him, it was both victory and curse. It had made him immortal, but it had also shown him the limits of control. He could command armies, rewrite history, kill millions, but he could not control memory. The people remembered the war in their own way, not through speeches, but through tears. When he died in 1953, millions mourned, but not all for him. Many wept for their fathers who never came home. For the sons buried in the snow along the Volga, Stalingrad lived on, not as a monument to Stalin, but as a wound that never healed. Decades later, the name would change. Volgograd, they called it, an attempt to bury the past, to remove the shadow of the man who had once ruled the world through fear. But even now, when the wind blows over the river, people still whisper the old name, Stalingrad, the city that burned, died, and rose again, because some names cannot be erased, some legends refuse to fade, and sometimes, even the darkest men in history leave behind the brightest fires. When Joseph Stalin's heart finally stopped on March 5, 1953, the Soviet Union held its breath. His funeral was a spectacle of devotion and dread, a sea of red flags, tears, and fear. Millions crowded the streets of Moscow, some crushed to death in their desperation to glimpse his coffin. Loudspeakers played solemn marches, and poets called him the son of nations. Yet, behind the hymns, the air reeked of relief. The god of steel was gone, but his shadow still covered half the earth. The Cold War was already beginning. The victory at Stalingrad had given Stalin not only prestige, but a myth that outlived him. The world was now divided, east and west, communism and capitalism, the red star and the white flag. For decades, every conflict, every revolution, every whisper of rebellion would echo the ghost of Stalin's image, fierce, unyielding, victorious, became the blueprint for dictators who followed. His war had birthed an empire of fear and faith. Inside the Kremlin, the machine he built kept turning. Propaganda offices still printed his face. School books still called him a hero. Yet the new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, knew that to move forward, he had to destroy the myth that made him. In 1956, behind closed doors, he delivered a secret speech to the Communist Party, a bombshell that shattered decades of silence. Khrushchev spoke of torture, of purges, of the millions who had vanished into gulags. Comrades, he said, Stalin's cult of personality is incompatible with socialism. The world outside never saw the speech, but its tremor reached every corner of the empire. The god had fallen from his pedestal. Still, even as Khrushchev denounced him, he could not erase him. Stalin's portrait was quietly removed from walls, but his legend remained etched in stone. The name Stalingrad could not be changed, not yet. It was too sacred, too soaked in blood. The city had become the heart of Soviet pride, the proof that the motherland could endure anything. To rename it was to deny victory itself. It took nearly a decade before Khrushchev finally did the unthinkable. He renamed it Volgograd. The name was meant to close a chapter. It didn't. For the veterans who had fought there, it felt like blasphemy. For the people of Russia, it was confusion. How could they erase the name that had saved their nation? And for the world, it was a reminder that history can't be rewritten simply by crossing out a word. The ruins of Stalingrad were still there, silent, unyielding, waiting for memory to return. As the Cold War deepened, the myth of Stalin was reborn in a new form, as the symbol of Soviet strength. In Washington, American generals spoke of another Stalingrad as the nightmare scenario, a place where Western soldiers would bleed against endless waves of resistance. In Asia, communist leaders invoked his name with reverence. Mao Zedong called him our teacher. Ho Chi Minh hung his portrait in Hanoi. Even when his crimes were known, his legend of endurance and victory still inspired revolutions. Stalin's ghost traveled through the decades, haunting every crisis. When the Soviets launched their first atomic bomb, they named the project after his code RDS, One First Lightning. When cosmonauts reached space, they saluted him as the father of their triumph. His paranoia had built a fortress. His myth had turned it into a religion. The Cold War was less a conflict of weapons than of memories. The memory of Stalingrad versus the promise of freedom. In the West, propaganda painted Stalin as the devil of the century. Films, posters, and speeches all carried his silhouette. Yet, paradoxically, that hatred only fed the legend. The more the West demonized him, the more some in the East remembered him as the savior who had crushed Hitler. The duality became eternal. To some, a monster. To others, the shield that saved the world from fascism. Time passed. Khrushchev fell, Brezhnev rose, and the USSR began to rot from within. Corruption replaced conviction. Bureaucrats quoted Lenin by day and hoarded vodka by night. Still, every February, veterans of the Great Patriotic War gathered in Volgograd, placing flowers under the towering statue of the Motherland Calls. They didn't speak Stalin's name aloud. They didn't have to. Everyone knew whose ghost watched over them. Then, in 1991, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union collapsed. The empire Stalin had built with terror and blood simply disintegrated. Tanks rolled through Moscow, not for invasion, but against their own government. The red flag came down, and for the first time in 70 years, Russia faced a world without its myth. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Stalin's ghost had finally faded. Monuments crumbled, statues were pulled down, textbooks were rewritten. But history has a cruel sense of humor. In the vacuum left behind, a new generation began searching for pride again. The wounds of the 1990s, poverty, chaos, humiliation, revived an old nostalgia. The people began to ask, when was Russia strong? And the answer, whispered at first, then shouted in rallies and classrooms, was always the same: Stalin's time. By the early 2000s, his image started to reappear. Old busts were cleaned and placed in museums. Documentaries spoke of him not as a butcher, but as the man who made Russia feared and respected. And under a new leader, Vladimir Putin, the myth became useful once more. Putin understood the power of memory. In his speeches, he called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He spoke of patriotism, unity, destiny, the same words Stalin had used, only softened for modern ears. By 2023, during the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Stalingrad, Putin stood before a crowd of veterans and soldiers. Behind him, banners bore both names, Volgograd and Stalingrad, as if time itself had merged. He declared that Russia once again faced collective aggression from the West, just as it had in 1942. His message was clear. History was repeating, and this time, Russia would again rise in defiance. On the same day, a bronze bust of Stalin was unveiled near the Panoramic Museum of the battle. Applause filled the air. The symbolism was impossible to miss. For Putin, reclaiming Stalin's legend meant reclaiming control over the Russian soul. To question the myth was to question patriotism itself. Once again, Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a mirror of destiny. And once again, a man was standing in its reflection, claiming its glory. In the end, Stalin's ghost never truly died. It adapted, evolved, and disguised itself behind new faces and new wars. His name may have been erased from the map, but it lives in the language of power, in the architecture of fear, and in the yearning of a nation that cannot forget. More than 70 years later, the battle still rages, not with bullets, but with stories. Because history is not only what happened, it is what we choose to remember. And as long as there are men who seek to rule through myth, the ghost of Joseph Stalin will keep whispering through the smoke of Stalingrad, not one step back. In modern Russia, history is not a book. It is a battlefield. The ruins of Stalingrad no longer smoke, but the war for its meaning has never ended. On quiet mornings, when fog rises from the Volga River, the city that once bore Stalin's name still feels haunted, not by ghosts of soldiers, but by memories that refuse to die. The people walk through streets rebuilt from ashes. Yet every brick whispers of 1942. Every monument is a wound, and every story a weapon. For decades, Stalingrad was both pride and pain, a symbol of sacrifice, of endurance, of resurrection. But in the 21st century, it became something more dangerous, a mirror for a nation trying to remember who it is. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Russians found themselves lost between nostalgia and shame. They remembered their grandfather's glory, but not their chains. The world had moved on, but Russia, like a ghost trapped between centuries, kept glancing back at the battlefield. In schools, teachers now tell the story differently. The Battle of Stalingrad is no longer taught as a brutal episode of survival. It is the rebirth of the Russian soul. The soldiers who fought there are saints, the generals, prophets, and at the center, still, stands the figure of Joseph Stalin, not the tyrant of purges, but the commander who saved the world, the man who turned ruin into redemption. Textbooks call him a controversial leader, but the message between the lines is clear. Without him, there would be no victory. On television, documentaries play with swelling orchestral scores. Black and white footage of the ruins fades into colorized parades. The narrator's voice, calm and grave, tells viewers, it was here that Russia became immortal. The camera pans over the statue of the motherland calls, her sword still raised, her face still frozen in the scream of defiance. Around her, tourists pose for selfies, unaware that they are standing on the bones of a million souls. Every year, on February 2nd, the anniversary of the victory, Volgograd transforms. Tanks roll through the streets. Veterans, their medals glinting under gray skies, march beside children holding flags. And for one day, the name Stalingrad returns officially. The city is renamed for 24 hours. Banners changed, signs replaced. It's a ritual, part remembrance, part resurrection. The past is alive again, even if only for a day. And in that day lies the secret of modern Russia's identity. Stalingrad is not just a place, it is proof. Proof that the nation can survive anything. Proof that humiliation can be rewritten as heroism. Proof that pain can be turned into pride. To the rest of the world, it might look like a monument to war. To Russia, it is a monument to meaning. When President Putin visits Volgograd, the symbolism is meticulous. He lays flowers at the eternal flame, stands in silence, and then speaks with the same tone Stalin once used, calm, unshaken, inevitable. He talks about enemies at the gate, about the West's arrogance, about the need to protect the motherland. The parallels are deliberate. The language of war has returned, not with tanks on the Volga, but with words on television. The world wants to erase our history, he says, but we will never forget Stalingrad. The crowd erupts. The myth is reborn. Yet, for those who remember, the truth is harder to swallow. Historians who dig too deep into Stalin's crimes still face threats. Archives remain sealed. The millions who died in purges, in camps, in famine, their ghosts are quieter now, drowned by the roar of patriotism. It is not that Russia denies them, it simply hides them behind victory. For every monument to courage, there is a silence around guilt. In the Museum of Stalingrad, you will find tanks, uniforms, medals, but not the names of those who starved under Stalin's rule. The past has been polished into glory. Still, beneath the surface, cracks show. Young Russians scroll through social media, reading Western historians and banned memoirs. They begin to ask questions their parents never dared to. Who paid for this victory? How much blood did it cost? Was it worth it? And in those questions lies the quiet rebellion that even Stalin's ghost cannot silence. But history, like the Volga, always circles back. The myth of Stalingrad survives because it offers something deeper than politics. It offers belonging. A people who have lost their empire, their ideology, even their certainty, still have the memory of triumph. And so long as that memory burns, so too does the illusion of power. The empire may have fallen, but the story remains intact. In recent years, Russian films have returned to the theme, cinematic epics filled with slow motion, heroism, blood, and sacrifice. They are watched not as history, but as faith. One director said, "We don't make war movies, we make resurrection stories." And that is what Stalingrad has become. Not an event, but a resurrection that never ends. Every generation is told that Russia's greatness is measured not by peace, but by how much it can endure. Outside the city, near the old trenches, stands a small cemetery where no names remain, only crosses and broken helmets. The wind whistles through the grass, carrying with it the faint hum of memory. It is there, more than in any speech or statue, that the real Stalingrad still breathes. Not in marble or myth, but in the silence of the soil. If you listen closely, you can almost hear them, the voices of men who froze to death for an idea too big for any one man to own. And maybe that is the final irony. Stalin built his immortality on victory, but the victory belongs to no one. It belongs to the nameless, to the forgotten, to those who fought without knowing what they were dying for. The dictator has faded, the city has changed, but the story endures, because it is not Stalin's story anymore. It is humanity's. In the end, the Battle of Stalingrad is more than history. It is a mirror held up to mankind. It shows what we are capable of, both in cruelty and in courage. It reminds us that pride and pain are twins, and that every empire that rises on suffering will one day face its own reflection. Stalin may have won his war, but he lost his soul. And in that paradox lies the eternal truth of Stalin, that from ruin, glory can rise, but never without ghosts.